Hey everyone, Cara Santa Maria here. And right at the top of the show, I want to thank the I Am Bio podcast for their support. Where do biotechnology, politics, patience, and our planet all intersect? Find out by listening to the I Am Bio podcast. Hosted by Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, I Am Bio brings you powerful stories of biotech breakthroughs. Discover the biggest threats to our planet's water supply, new vaccine technologies, the latest Alzheimer's research findings, and more. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 18th, 2022. Super close to Earth Day. And in honor of that, we have an excellent show for you today. We're going to be talking all about climate justice. But before we dive in, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be completely free to download. And I rely heavily in order to make it free for everybody on support from those of you who can afford to pay, because of course that offsets the price for everyone else. I want to give a massive shout out to my top supporters because not only do I thank them, but everybody listening to the show thanks you as well. You really do make it possible. So first and foremost, I want to thank Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman, among so many other wonderful folks. If you want to pledge your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. But there are other ways to support the show as well. You can shop in the Talk Nerdy store. You can access that by visiting carasantamaria.com or talknerdy.com or even talknerdymerch.com. Yes, all roads lead to the Talk Nerdy store, where we have all sorts of cool stuff, tanks and tees and beanies and hoodies and mugs and even like onesies for your bebe. Lots of fun stuff there in a bunch of cool designs as well that were created by some really great artists. And then also you can rate. You can review. You can just like give a shout out to the show on social media, wherever you download your show, whatever podcast RSS reader you use. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or the myriad others that are out there. A good rating goes a really long way because it kind of informs folks that the show exists, that it's worth listening to, and sometimes helps push it up in the charts. So thank you for all of your incredible support. And now let's talk about the episode. This is a really good one. So I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Elizabeth Cripps. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and the author of her first book, Climate Change and the Moral Agent. She was a journalist and then studied to become a moral philosopher, and her focus is on climate ethics and justice. She worked for the Financial Times. She wrote for The Guardian and The Herald. She's been on BBC Radio 4. She is really working hard to get this message out there. And her new book, where she really does focus on morality and intersectionality and kind of all of the complicated facets, but important facets that go into climate justice, is called What Climate Justice Means and Why We Should Care, by Dr. Elizabeth Cripps. So without any further ado, here she is. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So when your book came across my desk, I said, I have to talk to her. I have to have a conversation about this on the show. And, you know, what's interesting is I looked at my old episodes. I've been doing this for quite some time now. I think I'm on episode number, let's see, as of this episode airing, we are episode number 403. Yeah, and I did a little kind of control F on my computer to see how often I have actually done episodes about climate change and especially climate justice or climate change within a social context. And we really weirdly haven't done whole dedicated shows to this very, very often. It comes up all the time, regardless of the person I'm interviewing, this conversation becomes a part of the discussion. But to dedicate the full hour to it, I'm very excited to do, because I feel almost guilty that I haven't done it in a while. And now more than ever, gosh, on the heels of the new IPCC report, this is just an important conversation to be having.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I obviously think it's an important conversation to be having, and I'm not surprised it's come up a lot, actually, even when you're talking about other topics, because it is something that it impinges on pretty much everything now.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, before we dive into the actual content, the actual topic, I'm curious about your path and your journey. You are a journalist. You are also a moral philosopher. And correct me if I'm wrong, the journalism came first?
Yes, so I was a journalist sort of full time shortly after graduating back in the early 2000s. And I did that for a few years and then went back into academia and then spent the intervening years doing a PhD and then working in academia, researching areas broadly around climate ethics and justice. And then relatively recently had this opportunity, which I seized on, to be able to sort of combine the two and bring these ideas, which I think are so important, to a general audience.
And so, both in your sort of popular writing, but also in your academic work, these conversations are being had. What do you actually lecture about at University of Edinburgh?
So I'm a lecturer, a senior lecturer in political theory. And most
Hmm.
of the teaching I do is actually around climate justice. So I
Okay.
do teach courses very much focused on that. I teach some other areas of political theory as well, but that's my main focus. And I've been teaching that for some time now. And the students are obviously incredibly engaged, as so many young people are in these questions.
And so this might be kind of a wonky question, but you mentioned that sort of the I guess discipline is political theory, and you of course define yourself as a moral philosopher. What's sort of the difference between those two, and what is the crossover there?
Well, other people will probably define it in different ways, but as I see it, moral philosophy is looking at how we ought to live, and political philosophy, broadly speaking, is how we ought to live together. So how we organise our institutions so that they are just and representative. And I think I did my PhD in a philosophy department, so I consider myself a philosopher. And I think what I do is more moral philosophy, but also some political philosophy. But because I now work in a politics department, my job title is political theory.
Yeah, and I'm definitely interested in when you went back to school. Like clearly you had been entrenched in these topics. These topics had been really important to you, and it sounds like they were a motivating factor for going back into academia. What did you ultimately do your dissertation on? What were you studying as part of your PhD process?
So my dissertation was looking at collective responsibility and climate change. So the sort of question of how we make sense of the sort of moral responsibility that we have for the harms done by climate change when they're not things that we cause. It's not caused by any one of us acting individually. It's not even caused individually by institutions, although they do a lot to make it worse. There's this kind of gap at the global level where we try and make sense of this responsibility for harms that come about because of the way that we live together and the combinations of huge numbers of acts by individuals and governments and institutions. So I was trying to expand notions of collective responsibility to make sense of that, and then to think about what individuals should do in those circumstances. So I then did a postdoc focusing especially on that question. Well, what does that mean for us as individual moral agents?
And so I'm super curious. You've been promoting the book, but the US version comes out just this week. Um, and I'm super curious about the difference. And maybe you haven't had a lot of experience, or maybe you have plenty of experience to describe the difference between audiences from different nations. So clearly you're in Scotland, right? Are you
Yep,
in
I'm in
Scotland?
Scotland
Okay.
in
Yeah.
Edinburgh.
Uh, So you're in Scotland and you're speaking probably largely to Scottish students, although I'm sure there are plenty of immigrant students and plenty of students who come from all over the globe. But my show, clearly it's based here in America. I'm in Los Angeles. I'd say about the last time I looked at my demographics, about 70% of my listeners are American. And then they sort of go in the order you would think: English speaking countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and then countries where English is not the dominant language. But I have listeners all over the globe. All of that is to say, there are very different perspectives on climate change
Yes.
and climate justice, depending on who you talk to and where they are. Clearly, the Chinese perspective, the Indian perspective, but even amongst sort of Western industrialized nations, and depending on who is in whatever the administration is at the time, there are very, very different perspectives. So I'm curious. I mean, it's kind of a broad topic, but do you find it difficult to communicate with American audiences, or versus UK or broader European audiences? What's been the experience like for you?
Well, that's really interesting. And because, I mean, this is, as you say, the book has been out in the UK for a couple of months now, but it's coming out in the States on the 12th of April. So this is the first of my radio or podcast interviews about the book for a US audience. I mean, among my students, actually, we have a lot of international students at Edinburgh, including students from the US, and I found them generally to be, very engaged in these questions. I guess there's a couple of things to say. I mean, one is that there's obviously a big difference in kind of talking to an audience in, broadly speaking, the global north and the global south when you think about kind of the differences in accountability. So as a sort of relatively privileged person talking from Edinburgh, I think I can, as a philosopher, talk about what people living in a situation like mine, or broadly speaking in societies like the UK or the US, should be doing as individuals. What I can't do and wouldn't presume to do is to try and, start telling those who are in countries that are most impacted by climate change what they should be doing. In fact, part of what I talk about in the book is the need for participatory justice at a global level, which actually gives a voice to those communities and make sure that communities who are most impacted by climate change, including those in the global south, are actually having a say in global decision making. So that's definitely one thing that I would say. I guess the other thing that you say about how it sort of depends on your audience, even within the UK or the US, and how it can be almost politicalism. I think that's absolutely true. So it has become this hugely politically polarized debate. But actually, I don't think it should be. I mean, I think that this is really about pretty basic morality when it comes down to it. It's not a sort of controversial notion of justice that I'm talking about in the book. This is talking about, well, should we or should we not organize our societies in a way that, mean that they don't kill people and that they actually protect people's basic rights? That's not a particularly controversial model of justice. And climate injustice is very evident, even when we think in those kind of uncontroversial terms. So yes, it is hugely polarized. And there's some people who have written really interestingly and talk very interestingly about speaking directly to different audiences across the political spectrum about this. But I think the basic morality should be kind of fairly universal.
Absolutely. And I think that, this concept of what is versus what, the should and the ought, and this concept too of the wildly different perspectives of individuals who literally just happen to be born in different parts of the globe, and who happen to be born to different stratifications of privilege, and happen to be born to different sort of geographic and moral histories, is such a fundamental part of the conversation that very often here in the US, at least I can say, is left out. And even when there is a sort of more, I guess, progressive or liberal push to try and be kind of more global in our thinking about this, very often you'll hear conversations about, indigenous peoples here in the US, or you'll hear conversations about different kind of social strata here in the US. I don't often hear a global perspective amongst my friends and colleagues and peers. And it's pretty damning because this is a global problem. And it's a global problem that I think I can safely say the country that I live in contributed to like significantly more than most other people on the globe. Like we sort of really made this mess. And yet you hear oftentimes politicians saying, yeah, but the past is in the past. And, India, China, you can't do what you want to do. Or, these other nations who are starting to industrialize in a rapid fashion. You don't have that latitude to that. I know we did, but oops, and that seems to be the perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I think so. One thing about climate injustice and the way that it kind of affects different communities is that actually what goes on in a country like the US is kind of a microcosm for what's happening globally, and that it does tend to be very much communities of color. It will often be Black communities or Indigenous communities who are most impacted by climate change, and that's because of the historical injustices that mean that they are generally more vulnerable to these harms. And exactly the same is the case when we look at the situation globally, in terms of the global south being much more vulnerable to harms which are predominantly caused by the world's richest, whether that we look at that at a kind of country level or whether we look at it in terms of individuals within states. So that the two, I think very much go together.
Yeah, and I often see this big disconnect between sort of the production. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the harm that is caused and the responsibility for mitigation, the responsibility for change to try to, and at this point, as we know, every time we get a new IPCC report, it's more and more dire and more damning. And it's like, whoop, blew past that target, whoop, we're not going to be able to handle that now. So we've got to set our eyes on something new, which is just so dark. So maybe not even reversal, but definitely mitigation efforts. These individuals, these institutions, these nations, these governments who have done the most damage don't often seem to be the same people who say, well, it's now my responsibility to kind of feel a little bit of pain, the pain that's required to try and mitigate these problems. Like here in the US, we're still having large political arguments about whether or not it's financially beneficial to mitigate climate change. Like it blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying, really. I mean, interestingly, the new IPCC report is pretty clear that it will be economically more costly not to keep climate change below 2 degrees C. But yeah, there is very much this debate that goes on about the economics that seems, and I think in one way this is why I wrote the book, to kind of make clear that it's not just an economic problem. It's not just a technical or a scientific problem. I mean, it is all of these, but it's also fundamentally a moral crisis, because this is about actions by primarily one set of people, which is doing huge amounts of harm, which will disproportionately affect mostly the people who have done least to cause it. And that is just a really basic moral problem. I mean, it's a fundamental injustice. And I mean, what you point to when you talk about the kind of attitudes of countries like yours and indeed like mine is this kind of huge gap between where we are in terms of international progress on climate action and what a kind of just way forward would look like. Because if we think about responsibility for past harm, or if we think about who's benefited most from all the previous harm done by climate change all the way through from the Industrial Revolution, who's reaping the benefits of that, or if we think about the people who are best equipped to help simply because they're the richest, so it's going to be least painful for them to do so, it's always going to fall on countries like like ours. And yet there is this huge unwillingness to take up the responsibility. So we have this big mismatch between, this is what we should do if we want to try and have a just response to climate change, and where we actually are now.
And so I'm curious from this sort of moral, philosophical, ethical stance, when we talk about climate justice and all of the different multifactorial components that feed into grappling with a huge topic like this. As you just mentioned, the conversations are very often, sadly, within governmental spheres, within sort of the corridors of power, where meaningful decisions can be made that lead to direct action. The conversations are very different than the conversations that we often see in sort of academic circles, because in academic circles, there very often is this discussion of, okay, we all agree this is real. We all agree this is happening. We all agree that this is dire and horrifying. And we have looked at the modeling and we, respect the science. And so what do we do to move forward, and how do we do it in a way that it costs the least to the most vulnerable, and in a way that is just, and in a way that is egalitarian? Yet, when we actually look at as I mentioned, the players in power and the individuals who have the real sort of finger on change, the ones who have the control and the power to affect change, they're still going, I don't know if I buy this whole climate change thing. And to me, it's like, what do we do with that? What do we do with people who are blatantly looking at the data? And I believe, cynically, because I think they do think that it's real, and they have convinced themselves that this agenda makes more sense for them politically and carries more weight for them politically. But regardless of what you believe, they've got their fingers in their ears and they're going, la la, not listening. It's a totally different conversation that's being had. How do we even begin to grapple with that?
So I think it is. And I mean, I think part of that comes down to this, well, it's been made a matter of kind of political party orientation, almost sort of certainly political orientation. And that has been done, that's not an accident that has happened. There's a lot of really important work that's been done by social scientists exposing the role that essentially the fossil fuel industry and others with vested interests in that industry have had.
There were architects who crafted these messages cleanly.
Absolutely, and have used their economic influence to make sure that message gets across, and that it continues to be this matter of kind of, if you are in a certain political affiliation, you're just not going to have anything to do with serious action on climate change. And there's been some shift now. I mean, even with the fossil fuel companies, the shift has been away from outright climate denial to trying to sort of make it all about what individuals should do, and pushing sort of responsibility away from themselves as corporations to take action. But yes, I mean, so there is this huge gap, as you say, between what happens in political decision making and where the clear-cut morality is, the climate science is, and the often, the opinion of many of the public. I think one thing that's interesting is that actually among younger people, that divide is less clear. I mean, so if you talk to younger conservatives, they're actually, not nearly so unlikely to be, in fact, to be taking climate change seriously and to want action on it. So it seems that with that there ought to be a move across the political spectrum to recognise the urgency of this.
Well, and the truth is, at a certain point, they're not going to be able to ignore it anymore. And you would think that point would have already passed.
Yeah,
but the sad truth is that those of us who, as we mentioned before, are the most responsible for damage are also the most insulated against it. And so it's a little bit easier to ignore it because it's sort of not even though it is happening in our backyard, like we can point to evidence and data that droughts are worse than they've ever been and food insecurity is higher than it's ever been. It's still very easy if you are among the privileged class to sort of explain those things away and to look out your window and say, oh, it's a beautiful day. We are not being touched by this. Like when you've never seen what's happening in Bangladesh, when you've never seen what's happening in, poor inner city neighborhoods within your own country, it's easier for you to ignore the dramatic impact of climate change.
Definitely. And I think what's one thing that is both interesting and I think encouraging is when you look at the young activists, actually, there's very much, you could imagine that just because it will dramatically affect their generation, wherever they are in the world, they could just be motivated by that concern. So just sort of, if they're in the UK or the US, really saying, well, look, we're worried about our own future. And they are, but that's not all they're saying. The young activists are very much driven by climate justice rather than just, let's mitigate and protect ourselves in rich countries narrative. They are very much aware of the importance of protecting people wherever they are from climate change. They're aware of the international injustices that are going on here, as well as the intersectional injustices that are bound up in climate change, and they want to challenge them. And I think that in itself is encouraging.
Absolutely. You sort of pointed to something earlier that I think we both know is such an important topic to grapple with, and one that very often we don't in the public discourse, simply because the actors have successfully made their arguments against us grappling with this. So we kind of glossed over it, but I want to come back to it. This concept of multinational corporations who have a lot of power and also a lot of incentivization to keep the conversation out of their backyard and to shift the onus to the individual actor. And this is something that we saw. I think I am of this generation. So I was born in 1983. I'm 38. And when I think back to being a child in school and learning about reduce, reuse, recycle, and like kids of my generation were very, very aware of pollution and turn off the lights and don't waste water and all of these sort of, climate mitigation techniques. But I think this was sort of the era in which the onus was shifted heavily onto our shoulders. And we were sort of made to feel like we were ultimately responsible, and like this could all go away if we just, didn't let the tap run while we brushed our teeth. And I think that that's one of those really sad things that culturally the marketing campaign was so effective to shift the responsibility to the individual user. If you just bring your reusable bag and if you're just a little bit more mindful about how you shop, this whole thing could go away. And that's just like, it's just a lie.
It is. It's completely a lie, and it is, and that is very much the way that the big fossil fuel corporations have. Many of them have seized on that now to make this kind of admit that climate change is happening and say push themselves as trying to move forward towards renewable energy, whilst making it, well, it's about what individuals do, it's about the lifestyles that people choose to lead. And that narrative, well, for a start, it neglects the huge role that fossil fuel corporations have played and have played politically as well. It also ignores the fact that the top sort of 10%, the richest 10% of people are responsible for a huge proportion, more than half of greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh God,
so it
seriously?
ignores the kind of inequality. Yeah, it's terrifying. That was between 1990 and 2015. That was Oxfam figure. So, it's hugely unequal, the impact here. So to sort of make it about what everybody does is completely ignoring that. But it also, I think, ignores the fact that actually what we do as individuals is, a lot of it is determined by what choices our society makes available to us. So
yes. It's institutionality. It's systemic choices. Like this goes back to redlining. This goes back to, individuals living in regions where there's no options available because their entire culture was shifted in such a way that they can only do what they can do. They're not empowered to affect change.
Exactly. And I mean, it's about, it's all very well to say to people, oh, well, you shouldn't be driving. But if there is no affordable public transport available to them, or it's completely unsafe to ride a bike in their city, then that's just not providing them with a reasonable choice. You can't make it about it being their responsibility when the infrastructure isn't in place. So that's why one thing that I talk about a lot in the book is, it is important. Individual lifestyle changes can play a really important role, but they have to be, the sort of main aim, I think, has to be to try and drive collective change. And yes, they can be an important part of that, but they're not the only thing. And there's a limit to how much we can do as individuals. We need the collective and the political change to make this possible. Another thing that I thought is really interesting, going back to what you were saying about the sort of message to individuals, recycle, reuse, which is, of course, very important, is that actually there's been studies that have suggested that there's this disconnect between the lifestyle things that actually make the biggest difference. So things like whether you drive or whether you fly, whether you eat meat, and the things that governments are actually kind of pushing or talking about, which tend to be the kind of, I guess, less sensitive, harder to give up. The things like recycling is much less politically problematic to say that people should be recycling, that they should be eating less meat, or that they shouldn't be driving, or they shouldn't be flying on holiday. And so even where the narrative is on individual actions, there's a problem with pushing that too much anyway. But even when it comes to the actions that government materials tend to focus on, actually, they're often not the ones that are going to make the biggest difference.
Oh, you're so right. And they're so often even the those recommendations are so often quite fraught. I remember there's a Frontline episode here in the U.S. on our PBS station. Our public media struggles in the U.S., but we still have these beautiful bastions left, and I highly recommend that everybody who can partake and also support, because clearly this is very important. But I'm thinking back to a Frontline episode that really exposed a lot about, at least here in America, I'm not sure if this translates, but at least here in America, the problems with our recycling infrastructure and how the actual petroleum companies were very much behind this movement to put the little triangle on the bottom and make sure that it was a little bit unclear about what was recyclable and what wasn't. And so now we have an entire generation of people who are putting things in the recycle bin that the machines cannot handle, that absolutely are not recyclable, that actually make the entire problem worse because there's so much confusion about, and it was intentional confusion about what you could and couldn't recycle to sort of lessen the onus on these plastic producers.
I will look that up. That's really interesting, and unfortunately doesn't seem very surprising.
Right. It's horrifying. It's kind of well, let's just throw it in the recycling bin and everything's better. It reminds me of this very basic human concept. I can't remember who I first heard say it, but it resonated with me for my entire life. This idea of privileged Westerners love to talk about how they just throw things away. This is the concept I know in the UK it's often put it in the bin, but here in the US it's throw it away. We talk about the trash, right? We don't have the bin or the rubbish, it's the trash. But we just throw it away as if there is such a thing as away. We put things in the trash and then they just go away to a magical land where they no longer exist.
I think that's absolutely true. There's a really, there's an interesting sort of philosophical idea looking at the sort of environmental justice, which is this idea of kind of ecological space, so that when we think about the impact that we have on the world, we don't just think about what we consume. We also should be thinking about the resources that are needed to clear up after us. And I think so often we just don't do that because, as you say, there's this mentality of, oh, well, I'll throw it away and that's not my problem. But actually it is or should be.
Yeah. It's just, I know there's so many concepts to this very complicated issue. But if you sort of, this may be an impossible question to ask you, but if you did have to sort of stratify or identify, at the tippy top, or what is the thing that you're grappling with the most? What do you think is the most important concept for us, the sort of listener, the consumer, the thinker, the actor, to grapple with? Is it this issue of the shift of the onus from the large corporations to the individual? Is it collective action? Is it that governments need to step up more, or regulation needs to be what's the biggest change that you think needs to take place that we're just dragging our heels on?
Ultimately, the biggest issue here is that it's a collective action problem, and it's a collective action of a problem of a particularly difficult kind, because so much of the harm falls on people who aren't those who are immediately involved in the decision making. So it involves future generations, it involves people from different parts of the world, and that's what makes it so difficult to get action on this. So actually, morally, it's pretty clear cut. I mean, this is about really basic justice. This is about human rights. This is about not violating human rights, and is about protecting them. And it's very hard to deny, I think, whatever one's political affiliation, that is important, that matters. The difficulty is getting action when we have basically a failure both of distributive justice. So the burdens of climate change are falling very unevenly and are falling predominantly on those who are least responsible for it. But we also have this failure of procedural or participatory justice, where actually the power in decision making tends to lie with the people who are least inclined to push for action. So globally, it tends to be the global north, even when it comes to the big kind of international summits on climate change. They're not kind of transparent, clearly global representative decision-making arenas. They're complex diplomatic arenas with lots of vested interests involved and lots of clever politics going on. And then even within states, as we know, there tend to be failures for those who are most vulnerable to be properly reflected in political decision making, and I think that is what makes it so difficult. What we need moving forward is to correct that representative imbalance, to make sure that there is sort of genuine representative decision making going on about this, and I think to have a recognition of the importance, the basic importance of protecting human rights here.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to this sort of I guess I don't know if it's a formulated question in my mind, but this conversation about the influence of colonialism, of entrenched institutional and systemic racism, and how these long-standing and deeply influential historical norms and kind of like dominant power structures have deeply influenced, who's responsible, where does the responsibility lie, how have we shirked responsibility, sort of what the global narrative around climate change is. But the part that I guess gnaws at me is that this isn't just historical. It hasn't gone away. The individuals who have a vested interest in keeping their sort of death grip on that power are continuing to assert power. And because of that, we can't look at this with hindsight bias. We're in it right now, and we're actively fighting against those powers that be, who desperately don't want to release the reins and say, yeah, you're right, let's do something about this.
So I think that's really important to recognize that. And one reason it's important is I think that there's a way of thinking that has a kind of intuitive, immediate appeal that says something like, well, look, climate change is just so urgent. Let's just focus on just mitigating climate change and not worry about sort of questions of climate justice beyond that. Let's just throw everything at mitigating climate change by whatever means. Now, actually, even that isn't happening. And but that
Right.
also,
Even if we did that would be a step, sadly, in the right direction, but it's not happening.
Even that isn't happening. And if it did, it would still not be climate justice, because it would fail to address the fact that the people who even if climate change can be kept or could be kept below 1.5 degrees C, there will still be communities who are incredibly vulnerable, who will lose homes or livelihoods or be vulnerable to the spread of diseases, and those communities will need to be able to adapt, and they need to have the resources to be able to do so. And the reason that they are particularly vulnerable, whether we're talking about at a global level or whether we're talking about within a society like the US, the reason they're particularly vulnerable lies in these entrenched patterns of essentially institutional discrimination or institutional injustice, which has carried on from through the periods of colonialization and slavery, has left these kind of repercussions where some communities are particularly vulnerable and particularly badly off. And so when it comes to something like an extreme weather event like Hurricane Katrina, they are the communities that are going to be worst hit by it.
Yeah. And, I something that I, how do I put this? It's long been very resonant for me, this argument that I guess the reason I bring this up, good God, I'm not being very clear today, but hopefully everybody can follow me, is that I find myself engaged in institutions very often, and whether it be, the science communication world, the skeptics, like I'm very involved in a lot of skeptic communities, atheist communities, whether it be less so, I think, the psychology community, because that tends to be like very, very progressive and very liberal. But even amongst the liberals and the progressives, one of the things that I find that's really frustrating for me is the sort of moderate stance. And one thing that I often bring up is when Martin Luther King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, he grappled with this very concept. And so one of my favorite quotes of his is this one passage that he took out of his letter where he said, "First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom," etc., etc. And I increasingly find myself frustrated by my peers' view of like, well, we can't get too crazy about this. We got to be really measured. We got to please everybody. We got to maintain this moderate stance. And yes, there we were talking about racial justice, but that directly relates to climate justice. I'm worried about the moderates and about their undue influence.
I think there's definitely a line of response to environmental activists that really echoes what was picked up in that quote, and that is the line that says, "Oh, these climate activists are going too far. They're disrupting lives. They're doing all these things. They're basically getting in the way of the way we live, and that is somehow seen as worse than the status quo." And actually, if we look at the kind of the situation that we're in, and then we look at the kind of strongest political philosophical defenses of civil disobedience, this looks like just the kind of long-standing fundamental injustice that civil disobedience is designed to respond to. So just as with the civil rights movement, or for that matter, the suffragettes, we have a situation where actually a government or governments are failing to do their job and protect people. And so you have a movement which is saying, well, actually, we think we are justified in breaking the law to try and move the government towards justice. And I think that you're right, that there is this danger that people, the response can be to feel alienated by that, rather than to think, well, look, why are these people prepared to do this? What is it that's making them desperate enough to lie on the road or, glue themselves to buildings? And actually it's because they're identifying something that's gone incredibly wrong in the functioning of our society.
Yeah, yeah. It's I'm noticing that you are working on a book right now that is meant to come out in a year, The Last Parents on Earth, Raising Children in a World of Crisis. And this really resonates with me. I remember asking my own mother, who I love very deeply, who had me when she was a bit older. So this is a woman who experienced desegregation when she was a child. She's a Puerto Rican woman who grew up in New York City, experienced desegregation as a child, lived through the Vietnam War, and was very present for many incredibly political and social influential periods in our kind of nation's development. And I remember asking her recently, because I don't have kids and I don't plan to have kids. And I asked her, if you were me, because I'm 38, she had me when she was 35. If you were me, 3 years ago, and you were thinking about having kids, would you do it in this world? And she was like, I don't think so. It's different now. It's just different now. And I remember really, like, I wasn't offended by this. I deeply understood it. Like, we do live in a different world with different hopes and different cynicism. And what does the world that we're bringing our children into look like? And obviously, the choice to have children is very, very deeply personal. And I would never say anybody should or shouldn't do anything. I can only make that decision for myself. But we are living in a crisis moment that is very different to I guess I should say, the understanding that our parents had of what the future looked like. Maybe the reality was the same, but now we can't ignore it. We can't ignore it. We know the data is in front of us. And so we're being blind to it if we decide to ignore it. And that has to be influencing people's decision making. Right?
I mean, I think it definitely is, and there are young people who are not having children because they don't want to bring them into the world the way it is now. And I do think, and I mean, I guess we should say that this is, I mean, I think, as with you, I think when my parents had me and my sister, they had us sort of believing, and probably believing reasonably, that the life we would live would be at least as good or better than theirs, and that isn't the situation that I think we're in now when we have children. It's a really difficult thing to face up to, but it is also relatively privileged. It's a sign, I think, of my privilege that I can say that, in that there
that
are
you have
many
access to birth control
already.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that actually, yeah, you're right. I mean, that too, obviously, but also the fact that that there are many communities for whom that has been the case for a long time, that when you have children, you really don't know what the future will bring
you're
to
so
them.
right.
But they will be
Absolutely.
living with terrible risks and so on. But I think, I think that you're right in that it's a really difficult decision, and it's a decision that I think a lot of young people are finding weighs very heavily on them at the moment. And that's definitely something that I talk about in my new book. I mean, the real kind of focus of the book is sort of looking forward and saying, well, look, if we are raising children, and I have two daughters, in this time of crisis, I mean, we're focusing on climate change today, but climate change is only one of several major problems facing the world at the moment. What do we do? What do we owe our children? and how do we make sense of, our responsibilities to our children and all the other responsibilities that we have to everyone else in these times of crisis. So that's what I'm trying to grapple with in that book at the moment.
Yeah, wow. And so I guess that leads me to a very, very important question, which is how do you, as somebody who is grappling with these huge concerns, personally and professionally on a daily basis? I think for a lot of people, they just need outlets they ignore. They, get deep into reality television, or they, whatever their sort of panacea is. How do you, not find yourself in existential crisis on a regular basis? How do you maintain hope and find a balance in your life between your work and joy and love and meaning?
Wow, that is such a huge question. I mean, so I guess there is partly that, this is my job and it's something I think about a huge amount, and I go on climate marches and so on, so I'm very involved in it. But I do also have time out from it, as you say, escape to TV. I'll drink a gin and tonic and watch Bridgerton or whatever and escape, or go for walks and running and climbing or whatever. And one wonderful thing about having children is that they are very absorbing, so there's that as well. But I think I guess at a more fundamental level, there's being involved in trying to do something about this is, for me, and I think generally the sort of psychological research suggests, can be very important, can be very motivating. So there is a sort of response to climate change, which can be cynical, may not be, which is just, oh, this is terrible, it's all doomed, I'm just not going to think about it, we can't do anything now. And that is the wrong response. And in some ways, I think it's just as dangerous as climate denial, because it comes to the same thing, which is, well, let's just carry on as we are. And of course, that is not the case. I mean, the IPCC is saying there is still a window to do something about this. There is still a window to change this. And, even if we miss certain hit targets for temperature ranges, things can still be a lot worse or less bad within that range. So that kind of doomerist response is kind of dangerous and misplaced collectively. And I think individually we can earn hope, I suppose, by being part of trying to find a way forward. So I get kind of frustrated with the sort of middle-aged response to the youth climate strikers, which is, oh, they give me hope, aren't they amazing? Because clearly it's not their job to give us hope. We should be trying to do something about this crisis that we are currently leaving them with. But I think that we can find a way forward, and that there is real hope, and I talk about this in my new book as well, that this is not a kind of all or nothing choice, either don't have children or bring them into a terrible world. We can still do something about changing the world that our children will grow up in. And actually it's about, hope in a broader sense than that, in that it's not just about averting disaster, although that in itself is important enough. It's also about all the many other ways in which actually these changes to society, to the way that we live, could be better for us, so that the sort of health advantages of some of the lifestyle changes, which would be part of moving towards climate change, the fact that actually engaging more positively and directly with the natural world has huge psychological benefits, the fact that consumerism is actually psychologically not very good for us.
Right.
There are all these ways in which actually, if we sort of move towards a Green New Deal, or even a feminist Green New Deal, where we start to give more value to the kind of roles, like caring roles in society, that actually improve people's well-being, there are so many ways in which, this isn't just about avoiding calamity. This is also about an opportunity to create something really amazing. And so I guess I've gone slightly off topic there, but I think it does come down to that. There's this sort of, you can feel massively motivated by this. You can also feel incredibly disheartened and depressed, but trying to feel like you're doing a bit to try and make it better is itself, I think, really important. And of course, that comes with all the caveats that we need, you need a break. You can, there's environmental activists, especially the youth activists, face huge problems with burnout. And there are all sorts of issues around climate anxiety, which are, in themselves a manifestation of climate injustice that these are being faced. But I think that being part, doing something towards trying to promote climate justice actually in itself is kind of helpful to me, as well as to, I hope, generally.
Yeah, I think the thing that gives me hope, and clearly this is contingent on sort of what side of the bed I woke up on that morning. And just as you mentioned, there are sort of two sides of this coin. But the thing that continuously gives me hope is that we have all the tools at our disposal. This is not like some unsolvable problem where we don't have the technology, or we don't have the know-how, or we don't have the understanding of how to affect change. It's literally a problem of will. We know what to do. It's just a function of deciding collectively to do it. And I think that's the part that actually gives me hope. And yes, of course, it can also make me disillusioned when I go, why aren't people acting? Why are these, bad actors trying to prevent progress? But at the same time, if this were a technological problem, if this were an issue of we physically don't know how to get ourselves out of this, so we're doomed, I think we'd be having a very different conversation. We know what we can be doing. It's just a function of having the will to do it. And to me, that's actually more hopeful.
Yes, I mean this is something that we can solve, and
Yes.
that is, I think, the message that has to be remembered, because the more dire the warning gets, and the warnings are rightly dire. But the more people kind of respond to those by burying their heads in their sand and saying, it's too late, the more we kind of perpetuate this idea that we can't change it. Whereas, as you say, this is all stuff that we can do, and actually do at relatively little cost to ourselves, if we make sure that we're making these changes in rich societies like ours, and they're often changes that will actually benefit our own lives in many ways as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious, Liz, well, actually, I close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions, and I cannot wait to ask you these questions because it's going to be very interesting to me how you respond. But before we do that, I'm curious if there's anything that we sort of didn't tackle. Clearly, a big component, your book is what climate justice means and why we should care. And I think that we might have glossed over the why we should care because I'm making maybe an unfair assumption, but I feel like I know my audience pretty well. Like, we already care, like my audience is the audience that cares. So really we were talking about, the ins and outs of this, but I'm wondering if there's anything that we didn't grapple with that you feel like we should definitely mention before we move on.
No, I mean, I think as you say, from your audience, as you've described them, I think the why we should care question, I don't need to stress so much because they already do. I mean, I think that one point I really stress in the book is that this is, as I say, this is not controversial. This is about avoiding serious harm and protecting people's lives, and that is very uncontroversial. One thing we haven't really touched on is this sort of question of, well, actually, non-humans matter morally too, very possibly. And what happens to the non-human world is, it turns out, completely inseparable. What happens to us is inseparable from a non-human world. And in fact, in many ways, it's our kind of failure to realize that in societies like mine, many communities in the US, actually indigenous communities have a far better grasp of this than we do living in so-called Western societies. But the fact in which we've kind of commoditized nature has ended up being terrible for the non-human world, but also incredibly bad for us as well. And I think that is something that is worth stressing.
I think you're so right. I had an experience, and I don't know, I don't even know if I should grapple with this on air, but I had an experience just recently when I was recording an episode of my other podcast with my dear friends and really like brothers on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And I don't even know if this conversation would make it to air, but we were talking about some discovery of an extremophile who like somehow was able to do some sort of chemosynthesis and without oxygen and without light. And we were talking about sort of these cool biological one-offs that occur and how that might relate to our discovering life on other worlds. And, so this is a conversation that is like completely separate from what you and I are talking about right now. But I remember that, the first thing that was asked was, ooh, can we like use this to like solve medical problems? It was this like immediate extractive commodification view. Like, ooh, we discovered something new that's interesting and useful to me. How do I use it to my advantage? And I remember just being saddened by the fact that that is so normalized in our society and our culture, and not just normalized, but promoted, like that nature serves to be our medical and shelter and comfort equipment, that these are the building blocks for us as human beings to better our lives. And it's so normalized that that's actually in many circles viewed as something moral, right? Like that to put human life in front of everything else is the moral stance. And it just like, it bummed me out as I started to really think about the fact that we are just such an extractive species.
We are. And I mean, well, it goes into a whole
Right. I
different
know.
set
Like
of
right here at the end of the
philosophical
show.
questions. I know. There are a lot of reasons to think that non-human animals matter morally in their own right. They are like us in some pretty fundamental ways. And there are also reasons to think that, species and ecosystems have value in themselves. But I think it's also what we are facing up to or need to face up to more and more. And there's kind of areas like sort of multi-species justice or the activist Leah Thomas talks about intersectional environmentalism, but this kind of recognition that actually these injustices that we talk about, they go hand in hand. So our commodification of the non-human world is also often exactly the same pattern that has ended up being incredibly destructive to and exploitative of human communities. And the two, understanding the kind of interconnectedness of that pattern, and at a broader level, the way in which our own flourishing and well-being is just completely dependent on this complex ecological system that we live within, and that we are part of it. We're not separate or able just to reach into it and exploit it. And I think properly realizing that would have avoided a whole lot of trouble.
Oh, absolutely. And it really is only one step away. I mean, we look at throughout history, but also even in modern times, that sort of, racial and gender injustice. And we look at genocide, and we look at these terrible examples of human beings committing atrocities against other human beings. And, the sort of classic scholastic view is that like step one is the animalification, the beastification of the other, right? It's the in-group, out-group, and the fact that we literally make others out to be less human and more like animals. It's easier for us to commit atrocities against them. What a gross thing. I mean, because intrinsic in that is that we don't value nature. So it's gross for both reasons. Like it's gross because we are minimizing the human being, especially very often because of their race, because of their gender, because of their whatever, their disability. And then you add to that the fact that intrinsic in that argument is that animals are less than, that they don't deserve respect or life or, the ability to thrive. Like for both of those reasons, that is a very disgusting thing we do as human beings.
Absolutely. And this is, I mean, that's what the ecofeminist thinkers like Valerie Plum would really point out. But there is this kind of pattern of putting kind of rational white man on a pedestal, and the idea that somehow women or people of color are less rational and closer to nature and can be exploited, and that the natural world can be exploited. And actually, obviously recognizing that women and people of color are just as rational as white men is crucial. But there's also a point to be made about the fact that actually, well, why should rationality be the only thing that matters? There are other things like caring relations that are also incredibly important. And it is that kind of detachment of everything else from this kind of artificial idea of white male rationality, if you like, that has led to a lot of these completely interconnected injustices.
Yeah, and also that narrow view of rationality, that's a construct that we invented in order to maintain power. Like I see this all the time in sort of my psychology work, and I definitely see it in the skeptic community, this idea that sort of scientific logical positivism is like something to aspire to, and it's sort of like the most rational way to navigate the world. And it's like, oh yeah, so ignoring emotion is a great way to navigate. Like, who invented that idea that just not having feelings is going to ultimately serve you? It's just bananas that somehow that became the definition of what it means to be a sort of elevated human being. It's just, it's horrifying. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. And we're so close to the end that I have to ask you. So I close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions. And I can tell you that something like 90% of my guests talk about climate change in their answers to these two questions. And so clearly I'm not setting you up to say you shouldn't, because this is what you do for a living. But I'm so curious how you respond to this. Okay, so the very first question is, when you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you, so this could be very personal, it could be vocational, it could be philosophical, moral, and whatever context, whether it's very local, familial, or let's say national or global or even cosmic, when you think about the future, number one, what is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night? The thing you're most worried about, you're finding yourself struggling with cynicism, struggling with pessimism. What is keeping you up at night? And then on the flip side of that, to end on a slightly more positive note, where are you finding your optimism? Where are you finding, what are you looking forward to and hopeful about? I feel like these questions were made for you and for this book. Don't feel bad if that is your answer, is basically what you talk about in the book. That's quite all right.
So, of course, climate change. I mean, I think I would put it more, if I was to put it more broadly than climate change, it would be the kind of compounding or interlocking crises that we are leaving our children. So I'm a mum, I worry about my children's future, and I worry more generally about what is happening to the world. And yes, climate change, but also interconnected threats like the pandemic we've just lived through and the risk of repeating that, like antibiotic resistance. I worry about those. And I worry about the world that my children will be growing up in. On the other side, I guess my kids are also what give me hope for the future. And more broadly, I guess the capacity working among, being part of and engaging with people in the climate justice community, engaging with activists who are so incredibly committed to this, is itself a really positive view of human nature and of what humans can do. And so I guess thinking about my children and thinking about climate change can work on both sides of the equation.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I have to say, it's like, it's not uncommon, I think, when we really do grapple with these big, complex issues, that they do hold both sides of that equation, both sides of that coin, that they are simultaneously hopeful and hopeless. And this kind of comes back to the work that I do. I do psychotherapy with individuals who are struggling with life-limiting illness. So I work right now in a cancer center, and I work with people who are at every stage, whether it's early diagnosis, active treatment, very often survivorship, but sadly sometimes end of life. And I lean heavily on the logotherapy and existential approaches of individuals like Viktor Frankl, who writes about living through Auschwitz and how there is no hope, there is and no control, is something that was done to these individuals that they in no way had any control over. Yet, where could they find control? What could they maintain control over? Their attitude, their experience, there is always choice. Even in situations where we have very little choice, we can choose how we think about these things. It's not always easy. Oh, good God, it's not always easy. And it's completely not okay that many people find themselves in those situations. But ultimately, as you mentioned, it can be both hopeful and deeply hopeless. And a lot of that has to do with choosing to see the hope and to use it, which is not an easy thing to do, but it's something that we must do.
And I think to earn it for ourselves. I mean, there's an idea in that some climate psychologists talk about, the sort of idea of I think it's called dark optimism. I'm trying to remember the exact phrase. But
I love
kind
that
of idea that when things are really bleak, finding hope in your own capacity, and I think in the climate change case, the capacity of many other people to try to find a way through it. It is really important.
Mm-hmm. And it is the human, it speaks to the core of the human experience, the ability and the capacity for innovation, the ability and the capacity for problem solving and for cooperative action, even in the darkest of hours. And those are the stories that are the most beautiful stories in all of literature, in all of cinema, are the stories of people who found themselves in the darkest situations and yet managed to hold each other's hands and determine a path. And sadly, many of us don't have that opportunity. Many of us will die as a result of climate change. Many people will be devastated. And already have been. This is not a future, hypothetical. This is happening right now. And that is very, very, very sad. But those of us who are in a position of privilege and power and are able to weather this storm, I do think we have a responsibility to find that hope and that courage and fight. And I think that books like yours and work like the work that you do is so important for reminding individuals that they have that capacity.
Thank you.
Thank you so, so much for being here. Everybody, the book is What Climate Justice Means and Why We Should Care by Dr. Elizabeth Cripps. This was a really meaningful and really important conversation, and I thank you for having it with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.